Asma Al-Assad's public image underwent a drastic transformation, from being hailed as a symbol of modernization and hope to becoming one of the most reviled figures in the world. Born and raised in London, Asma was once celebrated for her elegance, intelligence, and Western education. In the early years of her marriage to Bashar al-Assad, she was seen as a modern, progressive figure in Syria, widely regarded as a breath of fresh air for a nation long ruled by autocracy. Her marriage to Bashar, a man with medical aspirations, was initially seen as a pairing that could represent the future of Syria, a blend of traditional Syrian heritage with modern Western sensibilities. The media often portrayed her as the rose in the desert, a reference to her poised and graceful public persona that stood in stark contrast to the oppressive image of the Syrian regime. In 2011, her profile in Vogue magazine encapsulated this image. The feature described Asma as a poised, youthful, and intelligent woman who had a vision for Syria's future. It portrayed her as a beacon of culture, secularism, and modernization, someone who sought to bring Syrian youth into the fold of active citizenship. At the time, she was celebrated as one of the few women in the Middle East to occupy such a high-profile political role. She was presented as a woman who was steering her husband's presidency towards reform, with the hope of promoting a more progressive, democratic Syria. Charm, style, and apparent commitment to her country made her an admired figure internationally. However, the onset of the Arab Spring in 2011 and the subsequent violent crackdown on protesters by Bashar al-Assad's regime marked the beginning of Asma's dramatic fall from grace. As mass demonstrations erupted in Syria, calling for greater freedoms and an end to the regime's authoritarian rule, the Assad government responded with brutal force. Asma's public image quickly unraveled as she became increasingly associated with the violence perpetrated by the regime. Rather than using her influence to call for reform, she remained largely silent, failing to use her platform to advocate for peace or a peaceful resolution to the escalating conflict. The international media began to scrutinize her closely, especially as the regime's forces were accused of using chemical weapons on civilians. Asma, who had once been admired for her sophisticated image, was now seen as complicit in the atrocities committed by the regime. The glossy magazine profile from Vogue was quickly overshadowed by reports of her lavish lifestyle, while the Syrian people suffered. Leaked emails revealed that she had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on luxury items, including high-end furniture, designer clothing, and extravagant decorations, at a time when the country was plunged into a devastating civil war. These revelations painted a stark contrast to the image of the compassionate, reform-minded First Lady that had been promoted just a few months earlier. In 2012, these emails were made public through media outlets such as The Guardian, further damaging her reputation. Asma was portrayed as one of Syria's most infamous war profiteers, spending exorbitant amounts of money while the country struggled with famine, displacement, and mass destruction. This image was further amplified by her family's fortune, which was estimated to be in the billions. Her relationship with her husband, Bashar, also came under intense scrutiny. Leaked communications between the two revealed their deep loyalty to each other, despite the growing international condemnation of the Assad regime. Asma's public silence regarding the violence and her apparent endorsement of her husband's actions made her a focal point for criticism, with many considering her an active participant in the regime's brutal crackdown. As her public image deteriorated, Asma's efforts to defend her position became increasingly futile. She attempted to maintain a semblance of normalcy, even seeking legal counsel from firms in London to shield her from the growing media attention and backlash. However, her efforts to silence critics through legal threats only added fuel to the fire, making her appear more out of touch with the suffering of her people. By 2020, Asma was sanctioned by the US government, adding to her status as a pariah on the world stage. Her transformation from Syria's First Lady of Reform to a symbol of corruption and oppression was now complete. This fall from grace not only tarnished her personal image but also further isolated the Assad regime. Asma's failure to use her platform to advocate for peace and her increasingly visible complicity in the regime's actions left her with few supporters, both within Syria and internationally. The woman who had once been seen as a beacon of hope for a more progressive Syria became a symbol of its darkest times. The dramatic shift in Asma Al-Assad's public image serves as a cautionary tale of how political power, corruption, and complicity can destroy even the most carefully constructed personas. Asma Al-Assad's role in the Assad regime has been one of deep political significance, despite her initial image as a modernizing, reform-oriented figure. As the wife of Bashar al-Assad, she became a central figure in the political landscape of Syria, and over time, her involvement in the regime's activities shifted from a symbolic role to one of complicity in the regime's more repressive actions. When Asma first married Bashar in 2000, their union was seen as a potential turning point for Syria. She was celebrated as a bridge between the West and the Arab world, a well-educated, Western-educated woman who seemed poised to usher in a new era of reform for Syria. Initially, Asma was presented as a figurehead for a modernizing, youthful Syria. The couple's marriage was seen by many as a symbol of hope and transformation for a nation long governed by authoritarian rule. Bashar al-Assad, who had taken power following the death of his father, Al-Assad, in 2000, was considered a more moderate alternative to his father's iron-fisted leadership, and Asma was positioned as the reformist counterpart. Asma's early years as First Lady were marked by her efforts to present herself as a champion of modernization, culture, and social welfare. She played an instrumental role in several charitable initiatives, particularly those aimed at improving Syria's health and education systems. She also worked to promote a more secular, Western-style image for Syria. Her work with youth and women's organizations was initially well received, and she was regarded as a role model for many Syrians, particularly those in the middle and upper classes. For a time, it seemed that Asma could be an agent of change in Syria's conservative, patriarchal society. However, as the political climate in Syria began to shift and tensions escalated in the Middle East, Asma's role in the regime became more complicated. The peaceful demonstrations of the Arab Spring in 2011, which sparked revolutions across the region, soon turned into violent uprisings in Syria. What began as protests calling for greater freedoms and democratic reforms quickly became a full-scale civil war. Bashar al-Assad's government responded to the growing opposition with extreme violence, and the situation deteriorated into a bloody and prolonged conflict. Throughout this period, Asma's role shifted from that of a cultural figure to one tied to the very machinery of the regime's repression. Asma remained largely silent during the early days of the uprising, and her public appearances became increasingly rare. When she did speak, it was often in defense of her husband's actions, supporting the regime's crackdown on protesters. As the war escalated, she became more closely associated with the regime's violent repression. Her decision to stay silent while her husband's forces committed atrocities, including chemical attacks on civilians, led to her being branded as complicit in the violence. The contrast between her earlier image as a modernizer and her actions as First Lady of a brutal dictatorship was stark. Asma's involvement in the Assad regime deepened with her increasing influence within the government. She became one of the regime's most visible figures, helping to shape public perception and playing a key role in maintaining the Assad family's grip on power. In addition to her public duties, she became deeply involved in the economic activities of the regime, which were increasingly marked by corruption. Leaked emails revealed that she and Bashar had amassed an enormous fortune, despite Syria's ongoing suffering. Asma's spending on luxury goods, including expensive furniture and jewelry, was widely condemned at a time when the Syrian people were enduring poverty and displacement. Her involvement in these financial dealings further tainted her image and solidified her role as one of the regime's most prominent beneficiaries. Her increasing involvement in the regime's activities did not go unnoticed internationally. Asma's association with her husband's violent and authoritarian rule led to her being sanctioned by multiple countries, including the United States and the European Union. She became one of Syria's most notorious figures, linked to the brutal tactics of her husband's government. Her role was no longer one of symbolic reform but one of active participation in the perpetuation of a dictatorship that had become infamous for its cruelty and disregard for human rights. Despite these growing criticisms, Asma remained fiercely loyal to her husband and the regime. She was not just a passive observer but an active participant in maintaining the Assad family's rule. As the war continued, Asma's public persona became that of a staunch defender of the regime. She continued to portray herself as a figure of strength, even as international pressure mounted and her once glowing reputation disintegrated. Her loyalty to Bashar and her unwavering support for his actions ensured her position at the heart of the regime, even as Syria fell deeper into chaos. In the later years of the war, Asma's role evolved once again, particularly as her personal health began to deteriorate. Diagnosed with leukemia in 2024, Asma stepped away from the public eye to focus on her treatment. However, health struggles have done little to diminish the criticism she faced as the wife of a man who had presided over one of the most brutal and destructive conflicts of the 21st century. Despite her illness, Asma remains a symbol of the Assad regime and the family's continuing influence over Syria's fate. Her involvement in the regime, from her early days as a figure of hope to her later role in the machinery of oppression, marks the complex and ultimately tragic trajectory of her influence in Syrian politics. The Syrian civil war, which erupted in 2011, has had a profound and devastating impact on the Assad family, both politically and personally. The conflict, initially sparked by peaceful protests demanding democratic reforms, rapidly escalated into a brutal and prolonged war that has reshaped the country and brought the Assad regime to the brink of collapse. For Bashar al-Assad and his family, the war has not only altered their grip on power but also transformed their global image, marking the end of their unchallenged rule and forcing them to confront the consequences of their actions. At the start of the war, the Assad family, led by President Bashar al-Assad, had ruled Syria with an iron fist for over 4 decades. Bashar had inherited the presidency from his father, Hafez al-Assad, who had established a totalitarian regime that emphasized control, repression, and loyalty to the Alawite sect. Under Bashar, Syria was initially seen by the West as a potential candidate for reform, largely due to his Western education and attempts to position himself as a more modern and moderate leader. However, the onset of the Arab Spring in 2011 quickly shattered any illusion of reform. What began as peaceful protests demanding political freedom evolved into a full-scale uprising against the regime, and Bashar's response, ordering violent crackdowns on protesters, cemented his place as a brutal dictator in the eyes of many. As the war intensified, the Assad family's position of power became increasingly tenuous. Despite their long-standing control over the Syrian government and military, the regime was ill-prepared to handle the widespread rebellion. Over the course of the next few years, the Assad family's hold on the country weakened as the conflict descended into a complex, multifaceted war. Rebel groups, including extremist factions, fought against the Assad forces, while external powers, including Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah, intervened to support the regime. The brutal tactics employed by the Assad government, chemical attacks, airstrikes on civilian populations, and mass executions led to international condemnation, but also to sanctions and diplomatic isolation. For Bashar al-Assad, the war was not just a political struggle, it was a deeply personal battle that threatened to dismantle the family's legacy. The conflict placed enormous pressure on him to maintain his power at any cost. While Assad's international allies, particularly Russia and Iran, provided crucial military and economic support, the war's toll on Syria itself was staggering. Cities were destroyed, and millions of Syrians were displaced, both internally and as refugees abroad. The economic and humanitarian devastation inflicted on the country only deepened the rift between the regime and its people, further isolating the Assad family from the broader population. As the conflict dragged on, the Assad family's image, once carefully cultivated, became synonymous with violence, corruption, and indifference to the suffering of ordinary Syrians. Asma Al-Assad, the First Lady, who had been initially hailed as a modernizing figure, saw her public image crumble. Her role in the regime's repressive actions and her lavish lifestyle, marked by spending on luxury goods while the country was in turmoil, led to her being labeled as complicit in the regime's atrocities. Asma's reputation, once that of an enlightened, Western-educated woman, was forever altered, and she became an international pariah, subject to sanctions and criticism. The regime's use of chemical weapons against civilians in places like Ghouta and Khan Sheikhon brought the Assad family to the center of global controversy. Bashar's attempts to maintain control over Syria, coupled with the regime's blatant disregard for human rights, earned him a reputation as one of the most brutal dictators of the 21st century. Despite calls for his resignation and the imposition of international sanctions, the Assad family continued to cling to power, largely due to the support of their allies and the military. However, the war also brought unforeseen challenges to the Assad family's grip on power. The growing influence of external actors, particularly Russia and Iran, shifted the balance of power in Syria. While Russia's military intervention in 2015 played a pivotal role in turning the tide of the war in Assad's favor, it also highlighted the extent to which the Assad family relied on foreign intervention to maintain control. Bashar al-Assad's once prominent role as the leader of Syria was increasingly seen as that of a puppet ruler, with his decisions being influenced by external powers with competing interests. The personal toll on the Assad family has also been immense. Bashar al-Assad's leadership has been marked by a deepening isolation, both within Syria and internationally. His family's wealth, once seen as a symbol of their dominance, has become a point of contention. The Assad regime's vast corruption, particularly in the form of state-sponsored theft and business dealings, has contributed to the country's financial ruin. As the war continues, Bashar's personal and political legitimacy is increasingly questioned, even within his own inner circle. The once stable regime that had seemed unshakable for so long now appears fragile, and the family's legacy is uncertain. In the end, the Syrian civil war has shattered the Assad family's long-standing grip on power and exposed the deep flaws in their leadership. While Bashar al-Assad may still hold on to the presidency, his family's future is tied to the ongoing conflict and the shifting dynamics of international politics. The war has not only destroyed Syria but has also altered the fate of the Assad family, turning them from rulers of a once proud nation into figures whose survival depends on foreign support and military might. The full consequences of this transformation will continue to unfold as the war reaches its conclusion, and the future of the Assad family remains uncertain. Asma Al-Assad's health has become a focal point in the ongoing narrative surrounding the Assad family, significantly impacting her public perception. Once celebrated as the Rose of the Desert, an epithet reflecting her Western education, beauty, and supposed modernizing influence in Syria, Asma's health diagnosis marked a turning point in how she was viewed, both in Syria and internationally. Her diagnosis of acute myeloid leukemia in 2018 shocked many, as it was revealed that she had been battling the disease privately for several months before making the news public. Her decision to step away from her public duties to focus on her treatment added another layer of complexity to her image. Before her illness, Asma was often portrayed as a figure of modernity, a woman trying to bring a sense of Western elegance and reform to Syria. She had been admired for her intellectual background, having studied in the UK, and for her appearance as a modern First Lady, balancing her role in a highly traditional, authoritarian regime. However, as Syria plunged into civil war, the glamour of her early years was overshadowed by her involvement in the brutal crackdown on protests, and the regime's brutal response to the uprising. Her spending on luxury items while the country suffered from war and poverty further soured her image, and international sanctions, as well as negative press, followed. Asma's battle with leukemia was framed as a personal struggle, but it also became deeply entangled with her controversial public persona. While some in Syria saw her as a victim of fate, others viewed her health condition with skepticism. The timing of her diagnosis, during a period of intense international scrutiny, raised questions about her family's priorities. Critics argued that her illness, while tragic, did little to alter her complicity in her husband's regime, which was accused of war crimes and widespread human rights abuses. Asma's health became another point of division, drawing attention to the contrasts between her privileged position and the suffering of ordinary Syrians. While she received international sympathy for her health struggles, many felt that the regime she helped support had caused untold suffering to the people of Syria, diminishing any potential compassion for her plight. Her health, and how it was handled by the regime, became part of the larger narrative of the Assad family's efforts to maintain their hold on power, even as the country disintegrated around them. The way Asma's health was presented by state media, and the fact that her treatment was supported by resources from the state, further complicated her public image. The idea that the Assads continued to live a life of luxury while the country was embroiled in a brutal conflict fueled perceptions of a family out of touch with the reality of everyday Syrians. Despite this, her diagnosis and her subsequent struggle with the illness continued to elicit some sympathy, especially among those who viewed her as a private individual rather than a figurehead of a despised regime. Ultimately, Asma Al-Assad's health, and the public's perception of it, reflects the broader complexities of her identity. Once an emblem of potential change and hope for a modern Syria, she became entwined in the legacy of her husband's ruthless regime. Despite her illness, the transformation of her image from a glamorous First Lady to a controversial figure remains a testament to the power of perception and the complicated nature of public life in a dictatorial regime. Her health struggles, while deeply personal, are inevitably viewed through the lens of her political role, illustrating the inescapable intertwining of private suffering and public responsibility. The Assad family's escape marked the end of over 5 decades of authoritarian rule in Syria, a dramatic shift that symbolized the regime's collapse. As rebel forces made significant advances, especially toward the capital Damascus, President Bashar al-Assad and his family found themselves facing an unprecedented crisis. Once viewed as a stronghold of unassailable power, the Assad family's reign began to crumble under the pressure of both internal dissent and external military intervention. As the opposition forces gained ground, Bashar's position became increasingly untenable, and the support he had once enjoyed from powerful allies, such as Russia and Iran, started to waver. The turning point came in December 2024 when the Assad regime, now severely weakened, could no longer sustain its grip on Syria. As the capital fell into rebel hands, Bashar al-Assad fled, seeking refuge in Moscow. This escape, orchestrated with help from Russian allies, marked the final chapter in the Assad family's rule. The flight of Bashar and his family was not just a personal decision but a necessity, as their continued presence in Syria had become untenable. For the family, this represented the ultimate decline, with their decades of power reduced to a desperate retreat, underscoring the brutal end to their once unshakable authority. The Assad family's escape signified not only the collapse of their political dynasty but also the unraveling of their personal and public image, as they were now seen as fugitives rather than rulers. The future of the Assad family is uncertain, marked by exile and diminishing influence. After their dramatic escape to Moscow, Bashar al-Assad and his family have been largely disconnected from the Syrian political scene, with their once imposing grip on power now shattered. While they have found refuge in Russia, their status as exiles carries a heavy burden. Bashar's role as the former president of Syria has been replaced by a fractured political landscape, with Syria's future in the hands of competing factions and international powers. Despite this, the Assad family retains some form of protection from their Russian allies, who have continued to offer political asylum, but their long-term future remains unclear. Asma Al-Assad, once Syria's first lady, also faces an uncertain future, especially with her ongoing health struggles. While she remains publicly supported by Russia, her political influence has waned significantly. The family's legacy, marred by accusations of war crimes, corruption, and human rights violations, may leave a stain on any future involvement in Syria's political landscape. Additionally, the Assad's wealth, built on a corrupt system, has been targeted by international sanctions, further limiting their options. Ultimately, the Assad family's future will likely depend on the broader geopolitical situation, with their fate uncertain in a post-Assad Syria, and their personal legacy left to history's judgment.